my favorite statistic is that women CEOs have happier employees. And at the end of the day, if there's no other takeaway, think about how the world would be a better place if there were happier employees out there.
Absolutely.
And when people ping me on, having my advocacy for women for my boys, I'm like, well, worst case scenario, they're working for a woman and they're happy there. And that's a win for me.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and/or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And we do this first as a Facebook Live event. It then goes to many different places, including YouTube and all the places our podcasts are available. And one thing I just want to say up front before I introduce our guest, I know you're going to be so interested in what she has to say, and you're going to want to contact her and find out more about her. If we are talking and you're interested, or wherever you're listening to this or seeing it, we are going to have links to anything she tells us to link to. So you're going to find it very easy to get in touch and follow up. So today I'm talking to Luann Abrams, who is the founder of CEOX, an organization whose mission is to elevate women into CEO and board roles in corporate America. And she's also involved in something called STEAM, which is STEAM, Science, Technology, Engineering, and the Arts and Mathematics. And I want to talk about that. She has a background in aerospace engineering and oversaw the certification of several aircraft models. So in any case, Luann, let me ask you first, you're in the Northwest somewhere right now. I touch base with you. Where are you sitting right now?
I'm in Bend, Oregon.
Okay. And before we get into these things that you've done in terms of helping people through CEOX and get into positions of decision-making in corporate America, women, what is your background? Because you've got the aerospace background. And then besides that, just talk to me about yourself personally. If somebody asks me who I am, I can tell them I'm a writer, but I can also tell them that I do childcare for 3 of my youngest grandchildren, that I do school pickups, that I don't try to separate work and life. I think it's all one package. And so, maybe I'm a writer, but I'm also, a very unpaid but highly skilled nanny of grandchildren. That's who I really am. And so let me find what's the road into who you are besides the professional stuff. Can be personal, can be who your parents are, where you live, what you're interested in. Just give us a little bit of information about you that is not part of this boilerplate of CEOX and all the rest of it.
Sure. Well, I'm living in Bend, Oregon, and Bend is where everybody from the Bay Area has moved through the pandemic. It's a beautiful outdoorsy mountain town. I'm married and raising my 2 boys who are 15 and 11, and there's no telling if one might make an appearance during this.
That's fine.
As it often happens in your conversations these days.
Yep.
I really had a tough year this year because we decided to have my kids do online school because of the pandemic. And so I got to oversee that as well and be much more involved in their education than I necessarily wanted to be.
Yeah.
But it was great. They both just finished up last week and got A's, and I know they learned a lot actually, because I was there watching and making sure they were learning. And so that's kind of, they're a huge focus of my life. They're also kind of an interesting segue into my work because my work is so focused on advocating for women and getting women into really high levels of power. And people ask me, but you're raising 2 boys. Don't you think that's going to be damaging for them? And I'm like, no, quite the opposite, actually.
Yes.
I think their lives will be better if they're living in a world where there are more women in leadership. So it's just kind of an interesting dichotomy. But I've been in Bend for about half my life now. I came here to work at a startup aircraft company. My degree is aerospace engineering, and I was an early employee. We grew that company to over 600 people, and I think you'll find that the common thread in my career is startups and working in male-dominated industries. So got to see all the ups and downs of a startup life at that aircraft company. And we ultimately exited to Cessna Aircraft. That's one you've probably heard of.
Sure.
And after that, I started getting involved in venture. And being involved in venture was, one, a huge learning experience. And two, I just really found it broken for women on many different levels. There are not enough women at venture funds deciding where money should go. That's resulting in women-led companies getting a very, very small percentage of venture money. Right now, it's at about 2.2%. And then this issue, which is a little more obscure that I'm working to solve now, is that it's not uncommon for founding CEOs to be replaced through the growth cycle of their companies. And because that happens a lot, what typically happens is it's investors that just go into their networks to find the next CEO. And most investors are still men, and they go into their networks and find other men. And I was watching this happen over and over again. And when it happened to be a women's healthcare platform for tracking your fertility, and they replaced that founder with a man, that was my moment of like, okay, the system is so broken here. I'm gonna try and fix it. And so that's where the idea of CEOX came from, really focusing on getting women into CEO roles at earlier stage startups.
And tell me about the X. I get the CEO part.
Yeah, so the CEO, the X started with the idea of the X chromosome representing the women, right? But now especially over the past several years, as I've learned more ins and outs of gender and identity, I really think of it more as X marks the spot. Where are you going to find a great CEO? That's CEOX.
Yeah, let me throw out a couple things here where we sort of have where our paths cross in a kind of an emotional connected sense, besides the big strokes ideas of what you do. My daughter is a CEO of a small company in New York City, and she, a few years ago, started telling me, and this ties in with exactly what you were saying about your sons, that something that always annoyed her was how sort of surprised and even sometimes affronted both men and women. She was working in Europe at the time, in Belgium and then in Italy, before she moved to the States and began to be the CEO of this company. And she would include in talks about her own journey in the business world, where she was living in Finland and then in Belgium and then in Italy and now in New York, and would tell people that she had learned more from the experience of parenthood than she had from anything in the business community. And she was always interested in the fact that there were a lot of women she was working with who almost regarded this not as a betrayal exactly, but as a bad move, as in, we're not being taken seriously anyway, and you had to bring up family and work-life balance. We've got to be like the men and just make it all about work. Now, that's a segue into something that I feel very strongly about. And that is one of the reasons that I think women make better leaders than men in almost all cases, and why, for instance, my doctor is a woman and has been for 25 years, my lawyer is a woman, and so forth, all the way down the list, is that the very fact that they have been forced to make these balancing decisions between empathy and work means that they're much better at the work as human beings, and not just on the HR level, on all levels. So, I having a daughter who has done the sort of thing you're advocating, but also having observed this idea that somehow it's all business, brings up a question that I want to start our discussion with you on. And that is, and I'm sure you've got something to say about this. It seems to me that one of the mistakes that has been made by people who advocate for women in business, as you do, is to not go far enough in demanding changes in the entire way we look at the business community. That, you know, we don't just want that 1950s male model of the guy with the briefcase and the hat getting off the train in Grand Central Station, acting as if he doesn't have a family, seeing his kids for a few seconds on the weekend. We want to get to where my daughter is, where she, for instance, if she was doing a school pickup, she didn't say she was on the way to a business meeting. She said exactly what she was doing. And you had to take her business leadership on the terms she wanted. And I'll go a step further and just say, from my point of view, the shoe's on the other foot. You know, the women who have been struggling with this have it right. It's the male counterparts in the business world, the academic world, the medical world who have gotten it wrong. And that is that they have decided that it's all about business and career advancement. And they have suffered terribly because of that. And so when you look at the statistics on loneliness and everything else, you realize that, you know, it's not only we need to bring change. This is just me speaking in terms of women and opportunity. We need to give men opportunities too. For instance, paid parental leave. And we have to say, listen, you know, you should take this. Don't worry that you're never going to get, you know, taken seriously if you do. You have to insist on this too. So just stepping back, my view is that if what you're doing at CEOX has value in the long term, it is to demand, I hope, more than simply a place at the table on the terms that corporate America, male-dominated corporate America, has dictated. For the sake of men, for your sons, I hope you're helping to change the way we look at the whole thing. So by the time they're your age or my age, they're working in a world in which other concerns besides business are not only respected, but are seen as important. Caregiving in all forms, whether for an elderly parent, a child, whatever. Okay, that's it. From now on, I'm just going to ask you short questions, but I'm trying to set up a bigger discussion here than simply the more narrow parameter of opportunity. I think there's a bigger thing going on, and COVID has accelerated this discussion. So over to you, and now I'll just sit and listen.
Well, that's exactly why I do what I do, because women in leadership are changing the culture, at least in their firms, so that it's better for everyone. They're not changing it so it's just better for women. They're changing it so it's better for everyone. And I have no doubt that the culture at your daughter's company, where she's the CEO, is such that if you need to go to your kids' play that happens to be at noon, you go to that. Man, woman, it doesn't matter. Like, that's important.
Yeah.
And that is part of why we need this change so desperately, because it's better for everybody. Another point I like to bring up, and you did that with, like, the ability for women who are moms and why they make such great leaders. Harvard Business Review did a study on, all the traits that make a great leader. And one of them is the ability to connect to the outside world. And of course, women scored higher on that one. And I think that's very indicative of how women can handle so many different things so well, and how those all filter into being a better CEO, a better leader, because you're not singularly focused. You're not just thinking, how do I make the most money at this company right now? You're balancing planet, profits. You are balancing your family. It just all kind of comes together under women's leadership. And my favorite statistic is that women CEOs have happier employees. And at the end of the day, if there's no other takeaway, think about how the world would be a better place if there were happier employees out there.
Absolutely.
And when people ping me on, having my advocacy for women for my boys, I'm like, well, worst case scenario, they're working for a woman and they're happy there. And that's a win for me.
Yeah, I've written this book, which we're not going to be talking about, but I have a whole chapter on the subject you just mentioned: fall in love, have children, stay put, save the planet, be happy. One of my chapters there on feminism and female leadership globally is that there are these incredible studies of even the actuarial tables of how long men live in more egalitarian societies. So for instance, in Finland and in Switzerland and Iceland and so forth, men live an average of about 7 years longer than they do in North American culture, and in other cultures in which women are denigrated or at least ignored and not given opportunity. And the reason for that is there's been all these studies, which I cite in my book, showing exactly what you're saying. Your sons in the future doing better because where they have real partnership with women, whether it's in the home or relationships or attitudes or in business or government, men do better. They live longer, and they commit suicide less often, and they have less nervous breakdowns, and they have less heart attacks. It's measurable. And then, of course, we've all seen the studies that are cited by people at the WBC, the Women's Business Collaborative, where I met you, that show that companies that have a good place and a good role for women are actually more profitable. This is arguable even on the profit side. So just go into some of that with a little more depth there.
Yeah, there are a lot of studies showing that women-led companies have higher stock prices, generate more revenue, grow faster. And for the early stage startups, which is really key because that's kind of my focus, they exit on average a year earlier. So if you're focused on the IRR of your investment in a venture fund, that's really key, that earlier exit. So financially, it's a no-brainer. Really, financially, it is a no-brainer. You want more women leading companies. So I think it's just a matter of breaking the habit. I always talk to the bottom line. Let's talk about money. If that's what your focus is, then you definitely want to hire women. If you're focused on creating balanced cultures where people thrive, then you definitely want to hire women. So there's really no downside.
Yeah, you were talking about the quality of life in a company run by women, and you mentioned my daughter again as an example of saying, well, in her company, probably, people are doing better. One of the things she insists on is that her male employees who have children take full family leave, and she makes sure it's paid and she makes sure they take it. Mm-hmm. And it's not left to chance. It's not that she encourages it. She said, if you're going to work in this company, family is part of the deal. If you want to advance in this company, you will take family leave, and you're going to you're going to find it actually helps your career here. So she sort of flipped it. And the same in all kinds of caregiving things for men and women. All her employees find that that's what it's all about. And they all are very productive, and they do better because of that. Just what you were saying, it's a happy company. Anyway, that said, let me ask you a question now about your own path. I find it so interesting because I've interviewed a lot of women on my podcast here who have come into business at various ways, whether it's, as doctors, and now they're teaching at a university or in corporate America. But I think it's unhappily unusual to have somebody come at this from a hard science background in aerospace engineering and not HR or something like that. Talk to me about your path, your sort of hard science driven path into this, and how you managed to survive in such a male-dominated field. I mean, aside from business, aerospace, I guess maybe the tech industry in Silicon Valley would be equally male-dominated, but it seems to me you picked about the hardest road possible.
I often talk about my very first business meeting as a young grad. I had just graduated my college with a degree in aerospace engineering. I'd graduated magna cum laude, so I'd done quite well. I walked into my very first business meeting. I was introduced around, and one of the men commented in full voice to everybody else, "Wow, she has great legs." And so that was really my first introduction into the world. And I think that a couple things kept me from kind of withering. One, I was raised with no boundaries. Even though I was raised in kind of a traditional household, my mom stayed home with us, although she ran my dad's business. My dad was out of the house working. she was home. So it was very traditional gender roles, but I was never, there were no limits on me. You know, my very first job was out on my dad's construction site, stripping forms off of foundations with him. And so it was just never an issue. When I went to college, even though the ratio of men to women at Embry-Riddle, where I went, it was 10-1. And it's still actually pretty close to that, as I understand. I still felt very equal. I never encountered any issues there. And so when I did get into the real world, that was shocking to me. I truly believed all that stuff was over with. And I think to this day, I think women coming out probably think that all that stuff is done. And they'll find out that it's not, that they'll have a lot of issues still. And anyway, to get back to how I navigated that, there were lots of times where I navigated it poorly. In that case, I was so taken by surprise, I did absolutely nothing. I had several other encounters through my career that could have really torn me down. And I don't really know why I persevered, but I did. And really on reflection, I was able to see those things that happened as a reflection of that person, typically that engineer, and not as a reflection of me. And probably it's because I just had such a strong foundation growing up. I was very, very lucky to have very supportive, loving parents, and was launched with that, you know, strength to get through that kind of thing. And yeah, worked, I think, almost 15 years in that industry, and just always did the best that I could. I think that in a lot of cases, I used being a woman for my advantage in that, you know, working with almost all men. I was able to talk with them and get them to do things in an easier way, I think, than if I was another man. So I really feel like I used some of my skills really well to my advantage. And yeah, after that exit, I ended up in venture, and again, super male dominated. And I struggled more with that because I would really identify with companies that I found interesting as a woman, and convincing the men in my partners that this was a great idea was really, really difficult. And these are all men, by the way, that I would consider them feminists, right? Absolutely. They're amazing men. In fact, you know, one of them who brought me on and hired me, but they just see things so differently. And it's just more evidence of the need for diversity, because if you just are seeing it in one way, you're investing in all the same things, and you're not diversifying, you're not solving different types of problems for different types of people.
Did you find when you were kind of in the aerospace part of the work, and then later venture capital, I guess, is what you're talking about, right?
Yes.
That when you had some of these problems with the Great Legs guy or whomever it might be, that you had any male allies. I've done some good interviews with some women leaders on just male allyship. You know, did anybody speak up and say, hey, Tom, we don't, you know, don't talk with that? Or the other thing of you know, you bring up an idea in a meeting and it's a good idea, and nobody pays too much attention, and then some man repeats it 5 minutes later, it's exactly the same thing, and all of a sudden it's, hey, Jerry, that's a great idea. Those two things. Or, you know, did you ever have conversations related to you when it was just the guys by themselves talking, and you heard from one of them that somebody had spoken up and said, hey, you can't talk to her that way? Do you have instances where there's some men, besides being, quote, feminists and helping out, actually did the right thing at some loss of face or risk to themselves, or did the allyship not go that far?
I would say in general, there wasn't much of that. I can certainly in that meeting, no one said a word. And no, I would say there was very little of that. I can think of one example, which is kind of funny. And so I was on the engineering side at my company. And then of course there's a manufacturing side. Yeah. So I reported to my VP of engineering. There was also a VP of manufacturing. And of course, because of my role, I was often working with both. And this VP of manufacturing, I can tell you, I thought he was unethical, not in a dangerous way for the airplane, just like, he just wasn't a good guy. Yeah. And I called him out on that once because I think he told me something that I knew was an outright lie. And I said, "You're lying. That is not true." And apparently, and I found out about this many years later, he apparently went into my boss's office just on fire about that and, wanted me disciplined or whatever. And of course, nothing ever happened to me. And I, of course, have to give credit to my VP in that case, because although I didn't know about it at the time, he did nothing. He let me speak my mind. He let me speak the truth, and not be penalized for it.
Yeah. So there was a little allyship there.
Yes. It wasn't obvious at the time. Right.
Yeah. But he sort of had your back.
Yes.
In a quiet way.
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about, just change gears here. Let me reintroduce you a second. This is Frank Schaeffer. You are watching and or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. If you want to get in touch with my guest, Luann Abrams, we will post links to CEOX and the things that she's involved with. Luann is someone who works on helping women find positions of power within corporate America, and also STEAM, science, technology, engineering, and the arts, mathematics. Can you just talk about these two? Is STEAM an organization?
So, yeah, that's part of a group of women in STEAM in my community where we're all there advocating for a gender balanced future in these
in those fields, which are often bereft of women.
Yes.
Very few. So I guess that butts up against Silicon Valley and the tech industry as well.
Yes.
When you say technology, you're not just talking about flying airplanes, you're talking about tech as well.
Yeah. Software and there are a lot of different avenues there.
Yeah. One of the women I interviewed quite recently was a vice president at Microsoft and has been there for 30 some years. And my producer, Ernie, will probably send me a message in a minute and remind me of the name. Forgive me when it comes to names. I really have a problem, but I don't forget the interviews. There's too many names. I've interviewed about 70 people in the last little while, so the names begin to merge. But in any case, what I want to ask you about in terms of both things, CEOX and STEAM, science, technology, engineering. I guess these are, in a way, different sides of the same coin. A, what sort of progress are you making? And B, what does a day look like for Luann Abrams? You get up in the morning, and by that night, what do you have hope to have accomplished in terms of placing women in better positions? Tell me how that works. Tell me what you do. Do people come to you? Do you go to them? Do corporations ask you to come talk? How do you make all this run?
Yes. Okay. So I've been doing CEOX for about 2.5 years now. So started it right before the pandemic hit. and it's all about proactively identifying women who would make great CEOs. And I do that by asking successful CEOs and senior leaders who they've worked with that would make a great CEO. And then they refer them to CEOX. And so a lot of my day is spent talking to really freaking amazing women all day long. I tend to have 3 or 4 calls with them in a day where they've been referred in and I get to hear more about them and their careers and their lives. And what they aspire to. So I have a really fantastic job in that respect. I also do a fair amount of outreach to venture funds so that because that's really who I'm catering to, because they're investing in these early stage companies. They're often the ones replacing CEOs at their portfolio companies. So they need to know that CEOX is here. And so I have a lot of conversations with investors through the day. And, I'm arranging different events. I am connecting people. I do a lot of connecting people. I've found myself often sending pitch decks on to my VC contacts of women-led companies. I think I've helped raise about $2 million now for women-led companies just by, I know they're raising, I know the perfect person to talk to and making those connections happen. And so to date, we've placed 6 CEOs. We've also placed several board members and other C-suite roles.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Besides the CEO position, I'm guessing you don't only go for CEO, you place women in other roles as well. Is that right?
That's correct. And I do really like to focus on the CEO. So when I talk about it, I very much you'll hear me talk about placing CEOs because 2 reasons. One, to date, I'm the only organization that I know of that's focused on placing female CEOs at companies. There's a lot of focus on getting women on boards.
Is a sort of a subtext to what you do? Are you sort of placement talent agency as well? Searching for people. How do people regard you in business? Are they coming to you, or do they know about you because they're actively looking for someone? Or are these positions you're kind of creating out of thin air?
No, people come to me when they're looking. So I would say about half my clients are venture funds and the other half are people at individual companies, often a CEO that one of 2 cases wants to replace him or herself and is looking for somebody to come in and take over. Yeah. Or another example is a spin out. I have one of my clients right now. He's like a serial founder. His current company has a product line that he wants to spin out into an individual company and is looking for a CEO. So and then of course with the VCs, it's often an underperforming CEO that they're replacing and looking for new ones there. So those are kind of the use cases. I also do work with recruiters. I really want recruiters when they're taking candidates back to whoever they're working with, that they have a diverse candidate base. It's really, so I do work with recruiters from time to time. Not all recruiters want to work with me. They consider me competitive, which I understand. I have a price point that's much lower than a traditional recruiter. And that's not because I'm trying to undercut the really good work that they're doing, but because it's disrupting the typical thing that is happening with venture funds, which is they're not calling recruiters in the first place. They're just going into their networks. So I am saying, at least come to CEOX. It's very affordable. It's very easy for me to go through and connect you with all of these amazing women that could come in. And so that's why I do it that way.
Do you find, because of your own background in engineering, that the STEAM aspect comes in that you have, of those 6 people you placed and so forth, do they happen to be in science, technology, engineering type areas, or is that just a different thing?
Tech, transportation. One of my favorites has been, so it was the CEO of a transportation company, talk about male dominated, who wanted to replace himself. He'd been running his company for 10 years and he wanted to do new things. And I was able to find him a CEO. And this one stands out for several reasons. One, because it's a male dominated industry. And two, because when I reached out, this was a woman who was in my network, who had been recommended as CEO ready, but she was a VP. And when I reached out to her, and I didn't know this at the time, she's since told me, she was talking with her husband and thinking, I don't think I can be a CEO. I'm not ready to be a CEO. And he's like, of course you are.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I feel like I have a huge impact too, and I've had several conversations with women who, when I first talked to them, they weren't thinking CEO was in their future. And after I talked to them, they're like, CEO is in my future. And then they've actually gone and gotten a CEO role. So I think just talking to people, talking to women, letting them, like, seeing their value and making them aware of their value is part of what I do.
Part of the thing, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the company that my daughter runs is related to your STEAM and acronym there, in that it's a company that specializes in helping municipalities switch to green energy alternatives. And before that, she was a lobbyist for the major energy companies in Europe, to the European Union. And then she got hired out of that to a company that was sort of venture capital, but then, as well as raising money for other people's projects, started one of their own, which is basically helping communities and municipalities in New York and other places switch or diversify into green energy. And she's in a field, again, that it's pretty male dominated. There are a lot of women who are interested in green energy, but they're not running companies that are actually working on the ground with communities and towns and cities to help them get into that. And one thing that she's found is that what you were talking about, when you're trying to find women to work with in that field, it narrows down pretty quickly. So I would imagine that, she's already the CEO of the company, but I'm imagining that STEAM aspect of what you do in terms of science and technology is a specialization in and of itself. Because of your background, you're aware of something. Because I think the complaint is often that women who are on some sort of corporate path toward a powerful position often aren't coming through the core technology that the company is about. Mm-hmm. They're coming in on HR or some other aspect of management. Is that true? And then, have you been able to find some women who are coming at it through the science technology side who can wind up in the management position? Or are they more within the company just doing the science technology, and the management is sort of reserved for another kind of thing? It's something I don't really fully understand, but I'm sure you run into it.
Well, first of all, if nothing else comes from this conversation, I hope you'll introduce me to your daughter.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Her name's Jessica, and she would love to talk with you because, your background is so interesting, is going to be so interesting to her.
Yeah. And so, to answer your question, I'd say there's no one size fits all. It's varied. I do have a lot of technologists in the community. I have a lot of people with more technical backgrounds, but I would definitely say a majority would be not necessarily HR backgrounds, but just in general business and operations. Sure. and that kind of thing. I would love to have more women CTOs in my network. I have a lot of women in cybersecurity, which is highly technical, a lot Sure. of women in privacy in my network. So I do think it's probably not as imbalanced as maybe we're led to believe. The fact that people talk about there being a pipeline problem all the time, I'm not here to say that there is not a pipeline problem. There is somewhat, but I think it's used as an excuse because people would, the whole reason, when I saw that that man get put in place of this women's healthcare platform. And I was like, what happened here? And I mean, I was talking to the investors. I'm like, hello.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, we tried. And so the question is, what does we tried mean? And I think for most people, we tried is like, well, we looked in our network. I went through my LinkedIn connections.
Mhm.
And if that's what we tried is, that's just not going to cut it, because we naturally tend to connect with people that are like us.
Yes.
And our lives become so much richer when we start connecting to people that aren't like us, and we learn. And that's another reason why I love what I'm doing, because I do meet people on a regular basis that are very different from me, have had significantly different careers and are in different industries. And I find it fascinating to build my network of some people that are so different.
You know, you had talked about your parents before. Just first of all, are both of them with us still? Are they alive?
My mom is. My dad passed 2 years ago.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
both of my parents are gone, but I'm a bit older, so that's easier. How old was he when he?
He was, I think, 84.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, and then what? Where was he retired when you were getting into the aeronautical engineering business? Was he
No,
around?
he was. Yeah. Oh, he was still working then. He
Yeah.
was so proud of me.
I was going to ask. I mean,
I'm
the
gonna
thing
get a
is,
little weepy. Don't make me cry.
if you were out there taking, you know, the mold, the stuff off concrete castings with him and so forth, he must have been so pleased with you. But also, you know, just tell me a little bit how he had your back. And you know, he's a bit of a role model there, and he gave you these opportunities, and your mom, and it sounds like a good relationship. And tell me a little bit about your dad.
Yeah, my dad. So
how he backed you.
Yeah, so he had a construction company, but that would be a very one-sided glimpse of him. He was an inventor, and he was a creator. He was a philosopher. I mean, I think his college degree was philosophy. And so all of that kind of combined. And I mean, I wish, I can't think of a specific time where he said things. He always, in fact, I was going through several months ago, just a bin of keepsakes I had in my garage, and I found several letters to me that he wrote. Like he was always good with expressing feelings. So he didn't fall into that trap of being stoic and, you know, of toxic masculinity. He was always happy to say, I love you. He was always happy to talk to other men and say those things. He was often in men's groups as we were growing up, and where they talked about issues like this and feelings. So I really felt, I can't think of one super specific instances. It was just kind of the culture around him and around my parents and around my family life. It was just like, I felt loved. I felt accepted.
Yeah.
And
I'm sure
felt boundless.
Yeah. And that built a lot of confidence to go forward. And so, you know, when you run into the opposition, at least you know what the alternative really looks like in terms of the love and support. It's really important. So when you are working with people who might be, you know, folks who might watch this interview here on Facebook and YouTube and listen to it on our podcast, you know, if you could push a button and get several things resolved in our culture that would make not just your job easier, but resolve some of the issues we're talking about, you know, where do you start on this? Is it male attitudes? Is it women and a lack of confidence because of the way what they come up through, like the person you were talking about? You know, what are the pressure points that are real that maybe we miss that you would like to see change, and you want to encourage people to think through in a different way. You know, you're mentioning again, I think probably in this interview you've said mentioned 3 or 4 ways this idea that you just stay within your own network, and they think, oh, well, now, I'm not connected to any, there are no women out there we can hire because we don't know any. And then the excuse is there's nobody in the pipeline. So what are some of these choke points that you'd like to see changed attitudes that can actually change if enough people say, hey, yeah, she's right. We can do something about this. Yeah.
So you were saying that I jotted down 3 I want to talk to you about. There's a lot, this is not a single pronged issue.
Sure.
But, there are lots of different things we need to be doing. One of the things that's top of mind is hiring on talent and not qualifications.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the reason why women are not given CEO roles. It's why people of color are not rising through the ranks like they should, because they are being assessed for their qualifications. And when you assess a person for just their qualifications, you're also assessing for the privilege that they've had in their lives. Mm-hmm. Most people with top-notch qualifications probably started on second or third base already, right? From where they were, who they were born to, where they were born, what their socioeconomic status was. Mm-hmm. Like, they started with an advantage. And so it was easier for them to get those qualifications that people tend to look for when hiring. So I really urge people to toss out that concept and hire based on talent and assessing things like someone's leadership abilities. Mm-hmm. So asking very different questions of, how do you handle a miscommunication? How do you handle a stressful situation? How do you come up with new ideas? What's your process for that? So asking very different questions when assessing for people is key. And then the awareness around that too is so important, because so many people like to get, one that the diversity hire certainly doesn't want to be known as a diversity hire, right, as they shouldn't. And then the people that didn't get that role don't get to complain either that they only got it because they were a diverse individual. Because so it's super important that when you hear chatter about that, that it's called out. It's like, that person is not a diversity hire. They assess that person for talent over qualifications. Mm-hmm. And life experience is part of that too. We don't want people that were raised in all the same ways, or we're not going to start getting new ideas. Yeah. It's just going to be, we're sitting there talking to the same people about the same stuff, coming up with the same answers. Like, life experience is really important. So if you're purposely seeing 2 people that are qualified and they go with a woman, you don't get to sit and complain about, oh, they hired a woman because it was a diversity hire. It's like, no, they wanted her whole life experience. They wanted some of these other skills and talents that she has developed by working her way through a society and that was not created for her benefit. And that creates skills and talent that you can't learn at Harvard, and really, really critical. So the hiring on talent over qualifications and awareness of why that's important and calling people out. And then you mentioned that, like, the confidence issue with women, and there's only one instance where I tell women that they should be more like men. And that's when they are applying to something or raising their hand for something new, because women do tend to not do that They don't want to apply for a job unless they have 90% of the skill set. And then men apply for it when they have 40%. And so that means there's just a lot more male applicants for a role. Odds are that that's who's going to get the role. And so really, women need to be pushing themselves to apply for things, even when they don't feel necessarily that they're fully qualified. My bet is always that she'll figure it out. And you want a job where you don't know everything. You will get bored otherwise, right? You want to learn and grow. And that's another great trait of a leader, is the ability to be curious and wanting to grow, not just yourself, but wanting to get others to grow as well. So the confidence issue to do that is really key. And I think it's Michelle Obama who talked about in her book and probably in some of her speeches that she's sat at these tables of the powerful, and she's not always that impressed by who's there.
Yes.
Right. And I think that needs to stay in the back of women's head, that these are not magical superstar people all the time. Some of them certainly are, but not always, usually not. And that they are probably very capable of doing that.
Yeah. Let me turn the page completely here a little bit. It seems to me in talking to a lot of people who are related, doing things within corporate America, that there's a tendency to avoid politics because, hey, you have a Republican who's hiring a person, you don't want to, start talking right away about your politics if you're to the left or to the right or whatever it may be. I understand that, but it seems to me right now we're in a global context of, as you and I speak, there's a war going on with Vladimir Putin attacking Ukraine. We've got a president being investigated in hearings that imply, high crimes and misdemeanors. What I'm trying to say here is not to put you in a corner and say, hey, tell me about your politics, but just like you had the foresight to choose COVID to try to launch a new business. I mean, I'm being facetious here, and now you're home with 2 kids and they're doing that. The real world intrudes on our best laid plans. Similarly, you're doing what you're doing in terms of gender equity at a time when it, like everything else, falls on a left-right divide, a Republican-Democrat divide. It's highly politicized. I read 4 or 5 newspapers a day, and some of the right-wing tabloids as well. They love nothing more than to harp on, affirmative action hires or whatever it may be. How are you dealing, you personally, Luann, and also in the sense of your business, with the fact that no matter what you do, there is the political implication to just the very fact of trying to fight for some sort of gender equity in this highly politicized, divided moment of our history? Do you have any thoughts on that? And again, I'm not fishing for anything here. I'm just curious because I don't think you can avoid it, but I'm just wondering how you're dealing with it and what what you think about what I'm saying here.
Yes, all those highly emotional men who are out there starting wars, right?
Yes, exactly. And contrasted, by the way, with the leaders of Finland and New Zealand and women who are doing wonderful things in all parts of the world who, if we could only have one of those women as our president for maybe 50 years and sort things out,
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually a very political person. I don't, bring up politics a ton in the course of my work, but I'll tell you one issue that is very relevant to getting women in leadership, and it's bodily autonomy. And with the threat of Roe v. Wade being overturned at any moment, that is going to be hugely impactful for women in leadership. And maybe that's part of the plan. I don't know, but that's terrifying. I mean, the fact that I was able to have my children when I wanted and is part of my success as a leader. And it's just, there's no debate about that. Like women, if if and when that is overturned and states start to then change the laws, I happen to live in a state where that will not happen. We will continue to have access to healthcare for women. But for those that are not, I'm sure we will see far fewer future leaders coming out of those states where abortion access is limited. And that to me is terrifying.
Yeah. Well, and you have the same group of people often pushing to not include contraceptive coverage in insurance policies and so on and so forth. Yeah, I don't think we can escape the political overtones of so much when it comes to anything meaningful, period. I mean, anything meaningful, of which gender equity and women in business is one of those things. What do you find is the attitude within the corporate, I guess, environment you work in? Is it, when it comes to the issue of choice and women and bodily autonomy and all the rest of it, where is corporate America as you dip in and out of various conversations on hiring women and this kind of thing? What do you find the sentiment is out there in, say, the male cohort, or more? Are you dealing with people who are more from the conservative side, or would you say they're more folks that you talk to who would understand what you're saying?
So quite frankly, I think I have created my own little bubble with CEOX, because you are not going to take my call. If I reach out to you and you look at my LinkedIn profile and read what I'm doing, if that's not something that you're into, you're just going to ignore me or not take my call. So in general, the people I talk to are very open to the idea of more women in leadership. And I think most people are smart enough to translate into, the rights for bodily autonomy for women and the right to choose what is going to happen to their bodies. So I don't know if I can give you I don't think my experience is probably the experience of others, because like I said, I talk to people who are open to what I have to say. And
I think the bodily autonomy thing is a good way to put it, because of course it goes into other areas of what I regard as assault on people. It's not just the availability of abortion and family planning and all the rest of this thing. It's living in a culture where the expectation of a woman is not to be assaulted, period, whether it's verbally or physically or anything else. And of course, being forced to bear a child is a form of assault. So I'll
never forget my OBGYN telling me, because I can't remember, I think it was my first pregnancy, and I kept having horrible dreams where I died during childbirth. And she was trying to set my mind at ease. She gave me her statistics of like, I've never had a patient die under my care, blah, blah, blah. And then she couched it, because she was super pragmatic with, it's also the most dangerous time in a woman's life is pregnancy. And I think that has really stayed with me. So when people start talking about, oh, well, you just give that baby up for adoption. Well, yeah, you have to get through it first and not die. Yeah. And, and my sister came close to dying during pregnancy. So that is a real threat and a real risk. It's not, we don't get to just be baby factories.
Did you come from a background where those views were yours for since a long time ago? Did you ever have any sort of change of mind on the issue? Was your family, where were they coming from on this? Has that been a journey for you, or have you kind of always been where you are right now?
Yeah, my parents were both Catholic. My dad actually was planning to be a priest in his early days, and yet they were definitely pro-choice. I don't really know how that evolved, but I think a lot of Catholics are in fact pro-choice. Not all of them. I do have a lot of family aunts, uncles, cousins who are not. And so I've seen both sides of that and lived it. And so I think I'm glad I was my parents' child.
Yes. Well, I came from a very fundamentalist evangelical background, and of course came out of that with a father who became a leader in the evangelical community. And so my journey after I left that was a complete change of mind and heart on all of the, many of these issues across the board. But it's interesting because from the background I came from, and him being so instrumental on the other side of the issue of the anti-abortion movement in the 70s and so forth, of which I was part of as his kind of nepotistic sidekick back then, having seen both sides of this and been in a family that was completely on the other side of the issue and very vehemently so at one point. You bring up a point about a lot of Catholics are pro-choice. I think what a lot of folks don't realize is that this evangelical litmus test on abortion that has so infected our elections is a new thing. Back in the 1970s.
Absolutely, yes.
Billy Graham, for instance, who was the famous evangelist, Dr. Criswell, who was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and that's bedrock. That is ground zero for American fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. They were both overtly pro-choice. And I was in conversations with both when I was in my 20s with my father. And they were both saying, hey, Fran, that was my dad, Francis Schaeffer. We can't go with you on this one. We think women have a right to choose. And Criswell even preached a sermon from the pulpit of First Baptist in Dallas on that, before, saying he was for Roe. I think a lot of people don't understand that this kind of politicizing of the issue, where it's a litmus test, where it's defining one whole political party now, and the justice appointments and so forth. This is a new thing. And it wasn't done for reasons of ethics. It was done for political expediency, fundraising, and all the rest of it. People just simply have misunderstood the issue. This is a long way from talking about CEOX, but as you say, it has such an impact on what you're trying to do. I don't think we cannot talk about that.
I agree with you. And I think I probably should talk about it more.
Well, I'm not saying one way or another. Yeah. I mean, it's like how often does one bring something up? But on the other hand, this is such a defining moment. I just can't see how we duck it.
Yep. I agree.
Yes. Okay. So thinking back over our conversation here, what have I missed in terms of an opportunity to get something from you that people need to hear? Think of what I might have asked better. And what would you like to add if I've not opened the door for you to make the point you want to make on either the STEAM project or CEOX or any of the above? Yeah. What would you like to include?
Well, first of all, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thanks for having me. I would say that if you are a senior leader, a CEO, you should be thinking through your network of women that you've worked with and nominating them to CEOX, the women that you believe would make great CEOs. So that's the first thing. If you are a CEO wanting to replace themselves, or if you're in venture capital, you should know about CEOX and make sure you are talking to diverse candidates at all hires, and then start implementing all the things we talked about previously about hiring for talent over qualifications, calling out when you hear people complaining about that. And for the women out there, hit me up. Would love to help you in any way I can get to that CEO. I want women out there to start thinking about CEO now. I start asking little kids, little girls, what do you want to be when you grow up? And when they say a teacher or a ballerina, I say, you should think about being a CEO. And then I tell them what that is.
Yeah, that's great. Well, listen, Luann, thank you so much for the time. I am going to trade an email with you and introduce you to my daughter, Jessica, so you guys can meet each other. And if there's anything you want Ernie, my redoubtable, wonderful producer and partner here, to post, just send him whatever it is you'd like us to put up in terms of information about you and links. and all the rest of that. So we can make sure that we direct everybody we can toward you as this goes out.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Frank.
Hey, this has been great. And all the best with everything. If there's anything we can do. One question I have for you. Since you place CEOs, we're always looking for guests to interview, which might be you again sometime if you have something you want to add to this or talk to us again. But if you want to contact Ernie and say, look, here's 3 incredible women that I've been working with who are either you've placed as CEOs or women in any related field or no related field that you know of, we really, the issues we were talking about today, you know, this is like of 2 or 3 main themes. This is what we do. We talk to women about trying to break some of these barriers. So please send Ernie, hey, Ernie, meet so-and-so, so-and-so meet Ernie. Tell us who we ought to be booking to talk to about this.
Okay, will do.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Ciao.
Bye.